This is Alan Stout from the Luzerne County Visitors Bureau, and on this episode of Next Stop, the Visit Luzerne County podcast, our guest is Bode Morin from Eckley's Miners Village, and we're going to talk about the history of the village. We're going to talk about the movie that they made there with Sean Connery that we know a lot of you know about. We're going to be talking about the plans for the future and how you could go down there this summer and have some great times. Eckley's Miners Village, spotlighted on Next Stop. Hi everyone, this is Alan Stout, Executive Director of Visit Luzerne County, and welcome to Next Stop, the Visit Luzerne County podcast. Here, each month, we'll be chatting with people from throughout northeastern Pennsylvania that help make our region a fun place to visit. We record the podcast right here at our office, inside the historic train station in Wilkes-Barre, which served as the next stop for countless trains for more than 100 years. Our next stop with our podcast will always be with someone we think you'll find interesting. Enjoy. All right, here we are on episode 4 of Next Stop, the Visit Luzerne County podcast, and our guest today is Bode Morin, the Historic Site Administrator with the Pennsylvania Historical and Museum Commission, who oversees Eckley Miners Village. Welcome, Bode. Welcome to Next Stop.
Thanks, Alan. Yeah, real happy to be here.
We've been looking forward to having you now for a couple of weeks since we first set this up. As most people may know, but in case you don't, maybe we have people watching this all over the world on YouTube sometimes. So Eckley's Miners Village is an historical miners village located in Weatherly, Pennsylvania, in southern Luzerne County. It's a tourist attraction, and it's got a rich history that involves an actual mining community that lived there for many years. It was featured in a feature film, and then it became, and after the film is really when it became an historic site. And so what we're going to do on the program today is, in the podcast, is talk about all of that.
Okay, great.
So let's go back to 1854.
Okay.
When this village is first laid out as a place for people to live. And I guess my first question for you is, what was the initial, obviously the mining industry is starting to take off. Mm-hmm. In a big way. Mm-hmm. But what was the impetus behind, the development of an actual village? Lots of people have jobs, but they don't always live together in such an organized communal way. So what was the purpose of a miners' village?
Well, first let me say that while you're absolutely right that the anthracite industry was really taking off in the 1850s. It'd been around for about 70 years or so. Had some trouble making connections between buyers and producers. But really by the 1820s and 1830s, you started to see this market grow in major regions of the country like Philadelphia and New York. So you started to see this industry really blossom and bloom. At the time, Luzerne County outside of Wilkes-Barre was still pretty rural. Right. You had a lot of farms, you had a lot of... You had some transportation corridors, but there wasn't really there weren't really densities of people here. When coal was discovered or identified in the eastern Middlefield, where Eckley is, you needed to really start from zero. And you've got a market, you need to start producing coal as fast as you can. And the best way to do that is to bring people where the coal is. So you've got these large coal deposits, but you don't have anybody around, to dig them out.
There are no houses to already move into.
That's right. There's nothing there. In fact, before it was Eckley, it was called Shingletown. So there was a small manufactory making shingles for houses. So by the 1850s, you need to, you've got a market, you've got to start producing coal, and you've got to bring people in. And there's no place to live. I mean, Freeland was around, but it was still very, very small. Hazleton was around, but it was 7 miles away, and there's no cars, there's no trains, there's no transportation. So you have to create a village. You have to create a place for people to live, to worship, to go to school, and to shop. And that was the driving force behind the formation of Eckley.
That makes total sense. Yeah. It wasn't like, hey, we've discovered coal under this town. Come move here. If you're going to work here, you need a place to live and as you said, worship, shop, and so
Yeah,
and a village was built just for that purpose.
Yeah, I mean, unlike, when we're getting later in the Industrial Revolution, you've got a factory and you've got steam engines, but you can put that factory where the people are. You just have to take the materials there. But if you've got a resource, like a natural resource, you've got to take the people to where the resource is to extract it.
Go to where the coal is.
Mm-hmm.
Let's talk about coal for a minute. The podcast is a relatively new format for media. Maybe 10 years or so. A lot of younger people like to listen to them.
Mm-hmm.
And so I talk from personal history here. I am the grandson of a coal miner. I remember my grandfather talking to me about mining. His brother died in a mining accident. Towards the end of his life, my grandfather contracted black lung, which probably led to his passing. I don't know if it was directly linked to it because he lived with it for a few years, but he had it. And so someone my age, 57, we knew miners. We did. We might be the last ones to say, yeah, I knew a coal miner. My grandfather's been gone for 45 years now.
Wow, yeah.
And so let's talk just about coal itself. I know that people know what it looks like. People know that it was here. People know that it was a major part of the economy here and the development of northeastern Pennsylvania. But we're going to talk about, how it affected the economy and the whole nation. But for someone that doesn't know that much about it, what is coal? What is it? We know that oil comes from supposedly dinosaurs, right? And I've often wondered how many dead dinosaurs are in the ground. They've been harvesting this oil for a long time.
There were a lot,
in mass quantities,
all over the world too.
So talk to us just a little bit about the chemistry of coal.
Well, coal is essentially carbon with some impurities in it. And if you think of charcoal, like lump charcoal or the charcoal that people used to make to run blast furnaces with, that is 100% pure carbon. And carbon burns. Carbon mixed with oxygen and flame will produce heat, and then it will give off carbon dioxide. So it is a carboniferous fuel. So its value, and it was the key factor in the Industrial Revolution was producing vast amounts of fuel. Prior to coal, you can imagine you've got to burn some fuel to fire your steam engine or to move a locomotive or something, and you had to use wood, or you had to turn wood into charcoal, into carbon, and burn that. And that's very labor intensive, and it takes a long time, and it takes a lot of trees to make a little bit of charcoal. Now you're looking at coal. So coal, you've got these vast fields all over the world of this carbon that it's not simple to get it out of the ground, but compared to the amount of work you have to get in to convert wood into charcoal, digging coal out of the ground, it's pretty much ready to go. I mean, you've got to size it and you've got to prep it a little bit, but it's pretty much ready to go. So the coal itself was formed not from dinosaurs, but from plant life. Okay. So from series, for multiple millennia, there were episodes of great swamps and forests that would grow up and die off and fall into the wet ground, and then it would get compacted by dirt and other materials. Then a new series of swamps would develop with new flora and new trees and forests and things. Then those would die off. So you've got all of these years of this plant life, which was it's carbon based.
Sure.
So over a very, very, very long time, 250 million years, the pressure and the heat from geologic action would transform that, all those other materials into what is primarily carbon, into a coal.
And is it, you said it's all over the world, but when we think of coal mining, we very much think of Northeast, we Pennsylvania, I know Virginia quite a bit too. Mm-hmm. Is there a reason that it became such a big industry here? Is there more of it here than in other parts of the United States or the world? Or was just this the region that said we're going to go get it?
Well, it's actually a little bit of both. So Pennsylvania has 90%, or it had 90% of the world's reserves of anthracite. So if you look at the qualities of coal, anthracite is the best. I mean, it's up to 99% carbon. So you can imagine when you burn it, it's a lot purer, it's going to burn hotter, and it's going to burn longer. It's really an ideal industrial fuel. But it's concentrated in Northeast PA. There's pockets all over the world, but it's mostly here. The next grade down is bituminous coal. And bituminous is by far the most common coal in the world. So it's found in western Pennsylvania. It's found in Virginia, West Virginia, Kentucky, Indiana, Illinois, Texas, Colorado. It's all over the country and all over the world. So it's a very prevalent.
You're saying we had the best coal.
We did. Anthracite was by far the best coal. But I think if you look historically in the United States, Pennsylvania is a unique state. It really latched on to industry early, and it was very innovative when it came to developing technologies and uses. And it was close to big cities. So it's a 2-hour drive to Philadelphia, but it might have been a day's horse ride, or not horse ride, but a day's train trip or something. So anyway, we're close to markets. So within those big markets, you've got new uses for coal developing all the time. Mm-hmm. So Pennsylvania had these vast resources, and really, surprisingly, up until 1985, we were the state that produced the most coal in the country, which is really astounding to me, because you've got huge reserves out west and huge reserves in Texas. So as these markets developed and demand grew, you've got people, the industry growing within the state to produce coal and feed those markets.
I remember mentioning my grandfather before, pre-Agnes in 1972 here in the valley. I'm guessing that the flood, because so many people had to redo their homes, they went to gas after the flood or electric. But I remember the coal truck coming down the street.
Yeah.
And the kids, we would all get so excited because they would put this long chute from the back of the truck right into the front of the basements of people's homes. They had the coal bin.
Yeah.
And the coal would come down the chute, and we'd all gather around the chute and watch the coal, coming off the dump truck into Grandpa's house.
Yeah.
And that's a memory too, that it still does happen. There's still some people that have it, but I think after Agnes was probably when a lot of people said, well, the furnace got wrecked from Agnes. Yeah. So now it's maybe a time to switch. Another thing regarding the coal in northeastern Pennsylvania that I've heard, I think I've even heard former Senator Casey talk about this, or Congressman, we're getting ready for the big America PA 250.
Yeah.
And I know you'll be a part of that too, and the Visitors Bureau is. So I've been going to some of the meetings where we've been talking about our role in northeastern Pennsylvania in the history of the United States. Mm-hmm. And I think it was both former Congressman Cartwright and Casey that talked about how, yes, not only did it provide jobs and help build these cities up, but it fueled the Industrial Revolution. Mm-hmm. That world wars were probably won because of the coal of northeastern Pennsylvania. Have you had those type of conversations and done those type of studies? Have you heard that?
Yeah, we have. So from the role in the Industrial Revolution, I talked about that a little bit, but I mean, it was all of a sudden you've got a fuel source that you don't have to process as much. And you look at the growth of Pittsburgh and Philadelphia and Bethlehem. I mean, those are all founded near coal sources, so that could really drive what they're doing. And if you imagine as a factory owner or something, being able to locate your factory anywhere you want, I mean, that is really a significant way to really maximize the efficiency of what you're doing, so you can produce more, you can lower your costs and things like that.
So the industry, they were coming here.
Yes, yeah. There wasn't a lot of iron ore in Pittsburgh. It all came from eastern Pennsylvania first, but then it came from the Great Lakes, but they came to where the coal was.
Wow.
Because it was cheaper, yeah.
So a city like Pittsburgh, that known for the steel, was really because of the coal.
Exactly. Yes. Yeah.
See, I knew you'd have a great story. That's why I wanted to probe that one a little bit more.
Well, I can mention a little bit too about the military. There's a rumor that I haven't been able to prove, that Erickson, who was the designer of the USS Monitor, the Monitor and Merrimack fame in the Civil War, that he specifically stated Buck Mountain coal should go into the furnaces or into the boilers of the Monitor. And Buck Mountain is where Eckley is. So we haven't found that quote attributed to him directly, but there is something out there that says that he specifically said coal from Eckley should be fired on the Monitor.
That's incredible.
But later on, when we move up after the Civil War into more advanced shipping and more bigger ships and battleships and things like that, anthracite gives you several advantages as a fuel for those ships. First, it burns hotter and it burns longer, so it takes up less space to get more fuel or more power out of for your ships. And secondly, is that because there's not a lot of impurities in it, it's nearly smokeless. So you can imagine if you're on the ocean, you can see 10 miles before the curvature of the Earth goes over. If you've got a ship burning bituminous coal, you might not see the ship, but you can see the smoke plume.
Yeah.
But if they're burning anthracite, you don't see nothing. You might see a little bit of something, but not know what it is.
For wartime, obviously,
so
much better.
Yeah, so it was important for that as well.
Sure.
And then into the Cold War era, there was still demand from the military to keep U.S. bases across the world free from political influences on fuel. So many of them still burned anthracite, in their boilers for their heating and for whatever sort of activities are going on there up until, really after the millennium.
Wow.
So you still had, and then somebody told me the other day there might be still one U.S. base in the country that still requires anthracite coal.
When you talk about Eckley, any conversation that I've ever had with someone from Eckley, they'll say, they filled the Molly Maguires there. I'm like, yes, we're aware. A famous film that came out in 1970, starring Sean Connery.
Mm-hmm.
Most people know that it was filmed there, but I was doing a little research, and what I learned, and I'm sure you know this better than anybody, is that it wasn't just filmed there. That because the village had been existing for 100 years before the movie, it had changed,
mm-hmm.
and they wanted this movie to be set in the 1800s,
mm-hmm.
and so they had to undo a lot of history,
Yeah,
power
yeah.
lines and paved roads and so forth,
Mm-hmm.
and make it look more like it did at the time of the Molly Maguires,
Right,
of course.
right, yeah.
And so the movie wasn't just filmed there. The movie essentially led to the establishment of Eckley's Miners Village. Yeah. I mean, that's the short version. Could you elaborate on that a little bit? That's pretty amazing. Paramount Pictures basically created Eckley's Miners Village.
Well, it is. I think it's a fascinating story because you have this village that's been here for 100 years. In the 1960s, you've got people that have very, very fond memories and very deep attachments to Eckley already. And it's still relatively intact. It had grown a little bit during those 100 years, but pretty much, the village that was there in the 1960s was the same village that was there in the 1860s. But like you say, yeah, it had
Evolved.
modernized.
Sure.
You don't put wood siding up anymore. They recovered the houses with this asphalt fake brick siding called Insel brick. They had power lines. They had paved roads and things. But the other thing that made Eckley attractive to Paramount was that it was still owned by a single owner. So that made contracting for the movie very easy. Instead of having to sign a contract with every homeowner, every landowner, there was just one person, George Huss, that they could contract with.
So they were all renters there at the
They
time.
were all renters. It's always been a rental village.
Okay.
There's always been a single owner.
So that hadn't changed by the 60s. So.
Right.
Okay.
So there was that attraction. So you've got a relatively intact you've got a relatively intact village that had been there for 100 years. You've got a simple contracting system. And there were still between 100 and 150 people living there. So you had built-in extras for your filming. So there are a lot of reasons that made Eckley very, very attractive to Paramount.
So they put the money in to undo 100 years of history. Yeah. And then, from what I read, the community said, look what they did. Let's keep it this way.
Yeah.
Now we've got a piece of history that we could really continue to celebrate, and here we are 50 plus years later.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. So they paved over. They buried all of the modern features of a town from the 1960s and recreated the 1870s. And they spent a fair amount of money. In fact, there's an author, Mark Noon, who teaches or used to teach out at Bloomsburg. They said this was a pivotal moment in Hollywood because they spent so much money to create this film. And it didn't have quite the returns they were hoping for, that it sort of changed the way movies were funded in the future. But they did.
Back to the lot on
Well, yeah.
right? In Hollywood.
Yeah, I mean, exactly, because well, I don't know the relative values, but I mean, it was an $11 million film, which was an enormous amount of money. And you had big name stars. You have Sean Connery just coming off of the first James Bond, Richard Harris, who'd been a pretty prominent actor, and was up until just a few years ago.
Yes.
And Samantha Eggar, who wasn't as big. But I mean, so you had big crews, you had big name stars, so it was a really big film. The intention after the Paramount was going to come in. They built a breaker, they built some shop houses, they built a company store. And the idea was that they were supposed to return the village back to what it looked like when they got there. And there was some rumor, too, that eventually George Huss was going to lease the property to be strip mined, because there's still pillars underneath Eckley from the previous coal mining era. But like you said, when they finished creating this set, so they covered all the insul brick with wood siding, buried the telephone lines, buried the power line, brought dirt in to cover the road. Hid all of the power electric meters, and some people in Hazleton said, you just created a historic village. Why are you going to undo all of this?
Sure.
And they formed an organization, a nonprofit organization, and raised the money to purchase the village from George Huss. And when after they took ownership, they donated it to the state as a historic site, and it became Eckley Miners Village at that point. And then that started sort of the heritage era of the site.
It's a great story, know. I mean, and you do hear stories sometimes about when a film director has tried to go offside. I mean, it's very well known that Steven Spielberg, as a young director, went against everybody's advice and decided he wanted to film Jaws on the water.
Oh yeah.
And he said it was a mistake he would never do again.
Yeah.
Because it was very difficult and got to be way over budget and so forth.
Well, the interesting thing, Mark, the point he makes is that a film came out just after the Molly Maguires called Easy Rider, and it had the exact opposite financing. So it was still shot on the road a lot, but it was just a couple actors, very small crew, very small budget, and yet it brought in a lot of money. So yeah.
The Molly Maguires, before we move off from the movie, like I said, people hear the movie. They know that they may have seen the movie a long time ago or even more recently, but their history obviously goes back to Ireland and came to America, and they were basically miners of descent, should we say? Is that how you would describe them?
I don't know that there was an organization that called themselves the Molly Maguires in Pennsylvania. There was an organization of people in Ireland, in County Cork, that called themselves the Molly Maguires. But they were dissident farmer, leasees on tenant farms, and they would rebel against oppressive practices there. Now in Pennsylvania, in the anthracite region, mostly in the southern fields, there were acts of violence perpetrated against oppressive mining practices. So there were landowners and mine owners that didn't invest in safety as much, didn't pay the workers very well. And there were reactions. There were violent reactions. There were murders. There were arsons. There were destructions. There are lots of claims of people having interactions or engaging the Molly Maguires in some form. But I don't think anyone's been able to prove that there was a group called the Molly Maguires. So we know that the acts of violence were real. Right. We know that the conditions that they worked under were real. But we just don't know that there was a formal entity that did this. I mean, it could have been different groups of people, different ethnic groups that weren't necessarily Irish.
If I'm not mistaken, those that were convicted of, acting inappropriately, there's a tie in there to, since we're talking about historical attractions here in northeastern Pennsylvania, to Jim Thorpe with the prison and the hand.
Yes.
Yeah. I don't know if for our listeners or viewers that are unfamiliar, some of the Molly Maguires, for lack of a better description, were incarcerated in Jim Thorpe, and executed.
Yes. Yeah.
And one of them said, I am innocent of these charges. And he put his hand on the wall in one of the cells and said, this will prove my innocence.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
And for 100+ years now, they cannot get that handprint off that wall. They have painted over it and chipped it out. And I've seen it on the tour down there. So a little bit of a Molly Maguire, Hazleton, Weatherly history that actually goes down the turnpike 25 miles or so to another historical footnote that a lot of people find very interesting.
Well, a series of the trials were held at the Carbon County Courthouse,
right?
And that's why that group wound up at the jail.
Wound up in that jail.
Yes, yeah.
And I don't know if it was called Jim Thorpe at that time.
No, it was Mock Chunk.
Right. Let's get to today. So we've got the history covered of not only mining and coal, but the film and how it led to what we have today. So we've got a 90-acre facility. We've got 200 structures, 2 churches, homes, a company store. For people that come to Eckley, describe the experience for them, and then there's also the visitor center with some great, a museum essentially on site. I mean, I've been there several times, as you know, we've met there. But, in your own words, Bode, what makes this such a great experience for people looking to explore that type of history? You can really see a little bit of everything.
Yeah. The 2 key features I like to think about is that Eckley represents an American experience. So you had lots of people immigrating to this country from the 1880s, 1870s to the 1920s to work in American industry. So you have a lot of these same populations in industrial regions throughout the country. Yeah. So we tell a very American story, the lives of people who emigrated from their homeland for various reasons, economic improvement, fleeing religious or economic persecution, or political persecution, seeking a better way of life. And this is this is the great melting pot. And that's what Eckley represents on one hand. But at the same, while it's a very American story, it's also a very unique story. And it's a very unique place because we don't have places like Eckley really anywhere else in the country. There are some older villages that are preserved, but as ghost towns. They don't really come in. People can't really go to those places and really learn about the everyday lives of the people that lived and worked there. So we're able to talk about, the family life, what it was like for you as a miner, to live with your wife and children and boarders and go to school, go to church, have to shop in the company store because you don't have any other options, and then really build a life for yourself. And so Eckley has those spaces, has those buildings that can really talk about that story. And I mentioned earlier that the people that we talk to today that have lived in Eckley have such a deep connection to the place, and I can imagine that deep connection going back 160 years. People loved Eckley. And whenever we post something on Facebook, we get hundreds of likes and people saying, "Oh, I remember my grandmother going to see my grandmother's house and playing baseball out at Eckley." So yeah, it's a great experience.
You mean they remember when their family actually lived there?
Yeah, but I mean, I'm talking about like the 1980s and 1970s and 1990s, that sort of thing. Yeah, we have a tour guide that his grandparents lived there, and he would come out and play with his brother in the yard, and they would play ball out front, and now he's giving tours of the village.
Have you been able, through your research with the Pennsylvania Historical Commission or just at Eckley, to kind of get a picture of life in the village? I mean, the men were working hard, a hard job, long days, and yet it wasn't their entire life. They had a day off, hopefully, or got home at some point before the day was done. And so, can you paint a picture of what village and family life was like at Eckley for people?
We do, and we try to do that. Of course, it evolved over time. But
could you tell us a little bit about it?
Yeah, in the 19th century, you've got a miner, which is going to be a man, who would go and he would work usually 12 hours a day underground. And then you can imagine in the wintertime, you're going down when it's dark, you're coming up when it's dark, and it's damp and cold underground. And they're mining coal. And if you do watch the mining scenes in the Molly Maguires, those are fairly accurate for that time period. So they're blasting, coal, and they're picking up the pieces, they're loading it into carts, and they're hauling it to the surface, to the breaker, where it's going to be sized and processed. And then they're going to come home from work at the end of the day, eat, and then go to sleep, because they've got to get up in a few hours and do the whole thing. Yeah. The wives, on the other hand, their days were just as busy, if not more busy, because they would get up before the husbands and prepare lunches and things like that for them. They could have up to 10 kids, 12 kids, 17 kids. So they've got a whole household, a whole house to take care of. The wives are also tending the garden. So if you walk out to Eckley now, and it looks like they've got these huge yards behind the houses, well, those weren't for relaxation. Those are for growing vegetables and crops and things. So the wives and the mothers are tending all of those crops, tending them through the summer, canning them, preparing them for winter and storage. So they've got to take care of the kids. They've got to take care of the gardens. They're serving as managers and leaders in the household. I mean, the husband isn't there.
I watched one of the short videos on the website, and I saw that the role of women, I mean, they were involved with the churches, in the schooling. Which, I mean, so a very busy. Dad's not around much.
Right, yeah.
Yeah. And so they've got their hands full.
Yeah, and they're also engaged with civic activities too. I mean, they still vote. People are still voting, so the women would tend the voting booths and the polling stations. And then they would also have tenants, because if you've got extra hands and extra people in the house that you have to care for and feed, but they're paying a rent.
Sure.
So you've got, tenants isn't the right word, boarders. So you've got kids, you've got boarders, you've got food preparation, food management, any sort of animals that they're taking care of that. And then the kids, so the boys, there were schools at Eckley. In fact, the location of the visitor center was where the last schoolhouse was. And that was an 8-room, relatively large school for the time. But there were 1-room schoolhouses and 3-room schoolhouses throughout the time. So the boys might go to school, from 5 or 6, maybe to 10, maybe to 11, and then they have to go to work because they've got to help contribute to the household income. And then we know the stories of the breaker boys, so in the breaker, coal would come up in very large chunks, and it would be crushed in the machinery, and then it would go down through these chutes. But also in the chutes would be slate and rock and wood bits and bits of broken machinery. So all of those things, all those impurities had to be picked out of the coal. So the boys would sit on these steep sloped chutes and then use their feet to control the flow. And then they would pick out these bits of slate and bits of rock and wood and so forth.
After they had already gone to school for 4 or 5 hours.
No, they would have stopped going to school by that time.
Oh.
So they're working full time.
Oh, this is after.
So they
some of the kids would go work after school, but some of them at a certain age would just.
Well, they stopped going to school after the 6th or 7th grade.
6th grade, is that what?
So by law, breaker boys had to be above 12, but we don't think there was much enforcement because we've seen pictures of kids that looked like they're 8 or 9.
I've seen those pictures.
Yeah.
Yes, I have. Year-round, Eckley does a lot of fun stuff.
Yes, yeah.
You've got events, Patchtown Days.
Mm-hmm.
Talk to our listeners and our viewers about some of the activities that you have going on that are either annual events that you do every year or things that you do occasionally.
Well, Patchtown Days is our big event, and that's been going on for about 30 years. And that's our celebration, usually on the 3rd weekend in June, where we recreate what life was like in the village. And then also we introduce activities that people would have enjoyed in the village, but bring them up to date a little bit. So this year, Patchtown Days is on the 14th and 15th of June. It'll be from 10 to 4 each day. There's going to be folk and music going on throughout the day. We'll have local bands from the Freeland area that have been around for 100 years themselves will be performing. Ukrainian and Irish step dancers. There'll be a small Civil War encampment. Food trucks, craft vendors, and a broom making demonstration, and blacksmith and things like that. So it's going to be a big and a fun event. And then last year we started a music event in the evening. So it was a bluegrass concert, and that was very well attended. So this year we've got a couple new bluegrass bands that are going to be playing in the evening after the event, and it's going to be Woodflower and American Buffalo Ghost.
Okay.
Will be the two bands that we're playing on Saturday night. So that'll be a big fun event.
And occasionally, because I know that we have promoted, I think it was last year here at the Visitors Bureau, you show them all the McGuire's, right, on site. Right?
We have. It's been a few years since we've done
maybe
it.
It was 2 years ago. Yeah, I remember we had it up on our billboard for a while.
Well, that might have been it might have been the Kirby. We haven't shown it since the 50th anniversary of the film.
Okay, no, you're right. We had
yeah.
It was the Kirby, but again, it still has it's still in the consciousness of this community because the Kirby was showing it. You're right.
Yeah,
That's where it was.
It's great to show it at Eckley because you're there. You're at the place where they filmed it.
Yeah, you can see it there.
In the opening scenes were them walking right down Main Street and walking out into the company store, that they built for the film, which we use as a company store exhibit now. So it's great to see the film.
You really feel that connection to the film.
Yes,
watching the film right there. There are plans moving forward that I know you made a big announcement a few weeks ago, and then there have been other plans that have been in the works for maybe 3 or 4 years now.
Mm-hmm.
And so let's talk about 2 projects that are part of the long range plan for Eckley. First of all, and I think there's going to be so many people that are interested in this, you're going to be offering people eventually, and I don't know how far you are from being there, we could talk about that, but people will be able to stay overnight.
Yes.
In the miners' homes.
Yes.
So
the overall plan, well, the big picture for us is to develop experiences and programs that can generate revenue that we can then invest back into the site. Eckley, as you said, is a large place with lots of buildings, and it's expensive to keep up. So we want to create experiences and activities that are going to help us in the long run continue our education mission and preservation mission. So we did a strategic plan. It was finished right before COVID, and we've been implementing it for the last few years. And it's to take some of the underused houses and convert them into something where people can stay. So there the opportunity for overnight short visits, moderate term, like weeks or extended stay, I guess, that kind of visit. And then we might be able to return some back into actual rentals. I mean, we have houses now that people are living in, but we'll have to update, the new houses for that. And along with that, we're going to convert the Foster House, which was one of the owners, one of the original owners of Eckley, Asa Foster, and for whom Foster Township is named, into an education and research center. So that is going to be places where universities and high schools can come in, and there'll be facilities to do research, do recordings, to document things, a wet lab for archaeologists and biologists and things like that.
Yes, I think when I first met you 4 years ago, when I came into this position, we toured that. We came down and toured that home.
Yeah, and it's a great building, and we have bits of Asa Foster's diary from the 1860s. I only say bits because he wasn't a very active diarist. So I think he would go in spurts and, keep a diary for a couple weeks, then stop for a year. But anyway, so we have we have his thoughts and what was going on in his life while he was living in that very house. So that's really exciting to do. And then the next building up on that side of the street, up towards the visitor center, it was a supervisor's house, and we're going to convert that into initially this sort of longer term extended stay housing. So ideally, if we've got a university group coming in from out of the area and they want to do research at Eckley, they can use the education center for the research, and then they would have a place to stay overnight.
I know we definitely toured that house the day that I was there. That may have been the one I was thinking of. These are such exciting plans, and I just think that there's a lot of people that would love to have that experience to just not just walk through the village, but to stay in one of the homes.
Yeah. It's interesting. I mean, my wife and I, when we moved to the area, we lived at Eckley for 6 weeks, and it was it was interesting because, you know, first of all, how quiet it is at night, which is completely opposite of the way it would have been in the 1880s or 1890s. But to just be in that place, to sleep in a house that was built in the 1850s, you know, and to think of how many people had been through that space, you know, and it's interesting. Yeah.
And one of the parts of the project, if I recall talking to you and Chris, is the adding of restrooms to those homes, correct?
Well, to putting in modern restrooms, yes.
Yes.
We do have tenants still at the village, and everyone that has lived in a house there in the last 50 years has had indoor plumbing. But if we're going to put contemporary uses in there, everything's going to be updated. So it'll be contemporary bedding, beds, furniture, kitchen appliances, and restrooms and things too. I mean, there is some talk about maybe outfitting an outhouse with a modern toilet, so you can have the experience of walking out into the yard to use the bathroom, but wouldn't necessarily have the full experience. They might, yeah.
And the big project that you just announced about a month or so ago was the breaker.
Yes.
And we shared that on our page immediately at the Visitors Bureau. Really, I don't know how many breakers there were around this county at one point, but not anymore.
There were hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of breakers throughout Northeast Pennsylvania.
I would imagine there were.
Yeah, and we know that the Huber was the last one. I mean, there's still some smaller breakers because we still have mining going on, but they're compact and efficient. And nothing like the giant breakers that used to be here.
And so what a better place to build one, to recreate one than at Eckley. And so that is now part of the future Eckley plans, that you will be constructing a breaker.
Yes.
Talk about that. That's so cool.
Well, the breaker is going to be part of a capital project. So over the next few years, we will be in stages prepping the land and developing the building there. Its function, it's going to be in much the same way that a breaker processed the material of a colliery. The new building is going to be an artifact and a collections storage center. So it's going to give us a place to store all of the artifacts from Eckley and maybe some regional PHMC sites as well under appropriate conditions. Okay. So heat, humidity, that sort of thing. But the building itself is going to replicate the breaker that was on site in 1915. Well, it was actually on site sometime in the late 1890s and probably existed up until the 1920s or 1930s. But the building will replicate that exact structure on the landscape very near to where that actually was. It's going to be a few hundred yards to the north, but it will be pretty close. And it's going to give us an opportunity to sort of realign the building to reflect the coal seam underneath. So it'll give us a better tool to talk about mining and geology at Eckley.
I'm really excited about that, and I know that so many people here in Luzerne County and Lackawanna County and Carbon County, Wyoming County, that feel this connection to the coal history will be excited to see a proper breaker that will be well maintained and new. Yeah. Because I think part of the reason that they're not here, and I did some research on Huber, was they weren't built to last.
Yeah.
They were temporary structures that were built to help mine that area, and then once the coal was gone, they generally had much use for it.
Yeah, they generally had a 30-year lifespan. Mm-hmm. But you can imagine there's crushers and there's conveyors, so all those buildings are shaking and moving around. They don't want to stay up very long.
Took a beating.
I mean, the wood breakers, there was an advantage to wood because wood was flexible.
Right.
But after 30 years, it wouldn't function as well as it did. So that's part of the reason. But also, as we get into more modern times, there's issues of health and safety. You can't have large liability structures on the landscape. You've got hazardous waste and other things around. So there's lots of reasons why breakers don't stick around much afterwards. And I think the Huber is an interesting story because I know that before the recession, there was a very positive movement to save it. I know the county was involved, several donors were involved, and it looked like it was going in that direction. But then, the economy did what it did, and it affected everything.
Sure did.
So I think that was the sad part of that.
And for those listening or watching, Huber is in Ashley, Pennsylvania, just a mile or two outside of Wilkes-Barre. And where the breaker was, they do have they have a historical marker there, and some remnants of what the breaker's gone, but they have a car from the mines, and there are some folks there that they're doing a nice job trying to preserve as much as they can.
Yeah, as a memorial. Yeah,
memorial. So if you are interested in the Huber area and you're a coal buff, it's worth taking a drive by.
Absolutely, yes.
And taking a look. More info about Eckley, website, hours, and so forth. So you're open what days per week?
Well, we're open Wednesday through Sunday from 10 to 4. And then we are open every day of the week for group tours. So if you've got a group of people more than 10, you want to come out and tour on a Sunday or a Monday, we'll do that. A Tuesday, we'll do that. If you're a researcher and you want to do some research with our collections, we're available 7 days a week for that as well.
Okay.
March 1st, we just went back to our 5-day week to Wednesday through Sunday. January and February, it's just Saturday and Sunday only. Website, www.eckleyminers.
It's a .com. I didn't know.
.com. EckleyMinersVillage.com.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's a .com. Before we depart, I always like to try. You're kind enough to give us your time and your expertise on Eckley. I'd like for a little bit to get to know the guest a little bit too. So, Bode, for you particularly, what was that initial spark that led you to having such an interest in history, that it's been such a big part of your life?
You mean me personally?
Yeah, personally. You. Talk about you.
Well, I'm from Detroit originally. And when I talked earlier about the similar communities, well, Detroit, as the Motor City, has very similar ethnic groups to this region. Very similar values. There's a very strong familiarity that I have being here than I did growing up. But where I'm from, much like you, I had experiences just like you, just a different industry. Every night at 7 o'clock, the whole sky would turn red because the steel mill was dumping slag. And it's like these things that were familiar to me, and when I get out of the area, it's like they're not familiar to other people. One of the interesting things too is that when I was, in high school, you drive by the bars that, at 8 in the morning, and there are people at the bars at 8 in the morning. I didn't understand that at first, but then you realize, right, it's third shift. They're off having a beer after work, just like anybody else on a Friday. So those things kind of led me to think about how the lives of people and how they interact with these things in the broader economy and broader industry. And then I went to graduate school and I studied industrial archaeology up at Michigan Tech. And while I was at Michigan Tech, we studied anthracite. And we watched the Molly Maguires. That was required. It was a required film for us for the classes. So I knew about Eckley and I knew about anthracite for a long time. And I worked in various museums in Birmingham, Alabama, and volunteered in Washington, D.C., and back in Detroit for a little while. And then the job at Eckley opened up, and I thought, wow, this, I've known Eckley my entire, career as a historic person, and so I applied for it, and I came out. So, and it's really a great place to be, and it's a great place to see, and it's great to be here at this time, I think, in this area. I know it must have been rough for some people in the 70s and the 80s as, the decline was hitting. But now there seems to be more of a resurgence. And people are interested in what we're doing. And, new populations are interested in the history of the region. So it's really a great time, I think, to be here.
What do you do in your free time to relax? What are some of your interests?
Well, my wife and I take advantage of the bike trails.
Okay.
So we're looking forward to, maybe this weekend we can get out and do our first ride for the region. The first ride of the region.
I think we've turned the page on the weather. I'm hoping it's for good. March could be a tease, as we all know.
Yeah. And then I'm a pizza guy too, so I like to experiment with pizzas at home and things that. I do some photography. I've done some painting, travel, and that sort of thing. So. And it's, and when we travel, we visit museums and we go to coal regions too. We were in the French coal region a few years ago for a conference, and we got to see what the French were doing with their interpretation, their coal heritage. Oh, wow. And it's a very interesting comparison to what we're doing here.
And you work hand in hand, Eckley. I mean, we tell people and I know you have some of the some of the mining materials there too. But if someone comes into the Visitors Bureau, for example, and says, well, I'm interested in mining history, our first thing, because we're the Luzerne County Visitors Bureau, is we're going to say go to Eckley.
Yes.
If they say, well, can I go down into a mine? No, but you can do that in Scranton.
Yes.
And then there's also the Anthracite Heritage Museum in
Yes.
Scranton. And so between the three of you, I tell people you could really do it all.
Yes.
You can see how they lived, you can see where they worked, and you can see their stuff.
Yes, yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah.
Right?
It's a unique region. You know, like I said, I've traveled through lots of industrial regions throughout the world, and we've got 3 mine tours. You know, and the Scranton tour, the Lackawanna coal mine tour, you can go underground. I mean, the other ones you can go into the ground, but that's the one you drop down, and it's a remarkable experience, and you can get an immersive experience here between Eckley, the mine tour, and then the Anthracite Museum.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Bode, thank you so much for joining us today on Next Stop. It was a pleasure to talk to you and learn so much more about the wonderful Eckley Miners Village Museum.
Well, great,
it's one of the crown jewels of Luzerne County, and we appreciate all the work you do.
It's one of the crown jewels of the United States.
Absolutely.
So thanks for having me. Yeah, it was a blast.
Thank you.
Sure.